third in the world in area after Russia and Canada, second in population after recently surpassing India. So what is China first in? Perhaps in the economy? It's hard to tell who's leading now. But where is China definitely first? So it's at home in Asia. We've already talked about the Chinese appetite and ways to spread their influence in Africa. A similar tentacle has launched into Latin America. China became its second largest trading partner in the year 2012. But all this will seem like flowers when you find out how China is acting in its region and what it is willing to do for its interests. Central Asia. This region came into China's sphere of interest immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan have long considered China as a key partner, ready to provide generous loans and finance economic projects of any complexity. Trade, investments, and large-scale construction are what connect China with the countries of Central Asia. China, as the world's largest consumer of oil, gas, and many other resources, understands the energy value of the region. These countries are rich in valuable resources. No less important is the Chinese desire to sell their goods in Europe. The mega-project One Belt, One Road covers the territory of all the countries in Central Asia. For these purposes, by the year 2022, China spent more than $3 trillion. And last but not least, the reason for interest in this region. Tajikistan and Uzbekistan act as a sort of buffer zone between Afghanistan and the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. This most closed region of China has constantly been popping up in the news headlines, so direct neighborhood with restless Afghanistan would not make life easier. In addition to direct investments and loans, China periodically allocates money to its allies on a non-repayable basis. In 2012, for the implementation of socially significant projects, Beijing directed $500 million to Astana, Bishkek, Tashkent, and Dushanbe. In addition, the People's Republic of China allocates quotas for free education at universities and factories. Of course, in Central Asia, there is no such thing as a free lunch, as is the case everywhere. The main tool of China's soft power remains credits, the debts on which are growing at an alarming rate in the region, except for Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Tajikistan's total debt to Chinese banks constitutes about 35% of gross domestic product, Kyrgyzstan's 22%, and Uzbekistan's approximately 20%. Because of this, governments are often forced to transfer their infrastructure, mining, and production facilities into the ownership of the People's Republic of China. For example, in 2021, the president of Kyrgyzstan, Sadir Japarov, openly admitted that if the authorities cannot find new sources of debt financing, they will have to hand over a large power plant and several important roads to China. In Tajikistan, Chinese companies control about 80% of gold mining enterprises. And in 2011, Tajikistan handed over about 1,000 square kilometers of its territory to the People's Republic of China as part of a new border agreement. This piece was located in the Pamir Mountains and made up about 1% of the republic's area. The authorities of Tajikistan called it a diplomatic victory. The local residents, of course, are unlikely to agree with such a formulation. On the other hand, it's not the worst outcome that could happen. You'll understand why later. India. It's clear that besides numbers, there are many other reasons for competition between China and India, and points of friction as well. But territorially, things are far from smooth between the neighbors. The main problem is in the Himalayas. British generals, who divided British India with the Qing Empire on maps, did not take into account that the high mountain region, with an average height of 6,000 meters, would become an insurmountable problem to this day. In 1894, British General MacMahon drew a line that is still named after him. He did this by agreement with the authorities of Tibet, and China does not recognize the MacMahon line accordingly either. The main event takes place in Kashmir, a huge Himalayan region located at the junction of the borders of India, Pakistan, China, and Afghanistan, and called the roof of the world in all these countries. For many decades, Kashmir remains divided into several parts. One of the reasons for the very bloody Sino-Indian War of 1962 was the fact that India was discovered and built by China through the Aksai-Chin Plateau, a strategic route connecting Tibet and the Uyghur Autonomous Region of the People's Republic of China. Delhi has always considered the mountain plateau as an integral part of its historical territory. In August of 1919, India stripped the region of Kashmir of its autonomy and established a new federal territory of Ladakh, which included the Aksai-Chin Plateau, which immediately angered China. And in the year 2020, another conflict occurred on this plateau, a very strange one at that. About 50 Indian and about 300 Chinese servicemen, as if they had agreed in advance, did not use firearms. Their fight resembled either a street gang brawl wall to wall or a medieval joust. Both sides went hand to hand, armed with rebar, batons wrapped with barbed wire, clubs, and slingshots. And no less than 20 Indians were killed, with the same number of casualties on the People's Republic of China side. In the process, a large number of Indians died trying to escape by jumping into the icy waters, located nearly 4.5 kilometers high in the disputed Galwan River in the Himalayas. 10 Indian border guards were taken captive, but were released after negotiations. The skirmish began after the Indians burned the Chinese tents they discovered in an area where, according to Delhi, they should not have been at all. Interestingly, the global Chinese One Belt One Road project practically bypasses India. Modern China and India are trying to identify points for dialogue. However, China does not recognize India as an equal partner, simply because this country, as seen in China, lives on its own wave. The South China Sea accounts for about $3.5 trillion in annual trade, which is a third of all global maritime shipments. The seabed of many parts of the sea may contain crude oil and natural gas, while other marine areas are suitable for rich fishing industry. As expected, in such an important strategic place, the interests of everyone who happen to be nearby have clashed. 7 countries claim various territories of the South China Sea, and neighbors' interests usually overlap each other. But one neighbor turned out to be noisier than all the others. The People's Republic of China not only disputes the maritime boundaries of its neighbors, but also tries to establish its hegemony in the region. Unlike other regions of the planet, the open sea is usually beyond the control of state power. But even here, something was found to cling to. Beijing's territorial claims are based on an ambiguous map from the 1940s known as the 9-dash line. This dotted line encompasses approximately 90% of the South China Sea and extends 2,000 kilometers from mainland China. Unsurprisingly, the neighboring coastal state does not agree with these claims. The conflict has long simmered only in the cabinets of officials. However, in 2014, China started militarizing contested areas. These are the Spratly Islands, and they are located in the very heart of the South China Sea. The Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Taiwan also stake claims on the islands, with Taiwan proposing the same conditions as China. In Beijing, they declared their claims to the islands largely because of the rich fishing areas and significant deposits of hydrocarbons in these places. By the year 2016, China had already developed 3,000 hectares of land on the Spratly Islands. Politicians from all countries in the region have crossed paths. The Philippine authorities, counting on Washington, turned to the International Court, which ended with the annulment of the Land Development Program. But China still placed military objects on the islands. Over the course of several years, the Chinese army has installed large-scale naval and anti-aircraft systems on 7 islands, as well as anti-missile complexes. And there is a deep-water port on the islands where large ships can dock, radio stations, bunkers and supply platforms, runways, and helicopter pads. The coastal defense of the People's Republic of China on cargo, non-military ships politely suggests that China fully controls the sea. Such a strategy prevents a possible armed conflict. But the sea corridor also attracts distant countries, including India, Japan, and Australia, for whom the sea corridor is vitally important. Japan, which has virtually no useful minerals, shows particular interest in this region. For it, the South China Sea is the main supply route, and the Japanese will not remain silent. To the southeast of Hainan Island is a chain of reefs known as the Paracel Islands. This territory is disputed by China, Taiwan, and Vietnam. The interests of the underwater are more obvious here, as the Paracel Islands serve as a shield for Hainan Island, where the Chinese submarine nuclear fleet is based. Even more importantly, whoever simultaneously controls the Paracel Islands and Hainan Island has the ability to cut Vietnam at its narrowest point, striking the Annamite Range, which effectively divides the country into two parts. That's why there were constant skirmishes between Vietnam and China over the Paracel Islands in the 20th century. And it seems the People's Republic of China is achieving its goals. The Chinese are already sitting on 8 islands out of about 30. On Woody Island, they built a large military base, where almost 1,500 military personnel are stationed, managing radiolocation stations, missile installations, and an airfield. And this is the Spratly Scarborough, a triangular chain of sunken rocks and reefs, which is also located next to the Philippines. In 2012, China suddenly seized the shoal for itself. Initially, Filipino politicians were hoping for the protection of their territories from Washington, as stated in the Mutual Defense Agreement between the Philippines and the United States of America. But the Obama administration refused to confront China over the shoal, only issuing a note of protest. After such a turn of events, relations between Manila and Washington sharply deteriorated, and the Filipino leadership turned to China with the aim of establishing new agreements. China gained the right to mine valuable minerals and fish in exchange for investments in the Philippine infrastructure. However, the parties agreed that there would be no Chinese military base on the Scarborough Shoal, as a large part of the country falls within the potential radius of the missiles. But there is another meaning to the capture of this shoal. The eastern border of the South China Sea is surrounded by a whole archipelago of small islands, stretching from Japan to Indonesia. It's called the First Island Chain, and for Chinese ships to pass through and reach the Pacific Ocean, they would have to navigate all the problematic points vulnerable to land, air, or sea capture. The Philippines is the only state along the chain of islands that has proven to be weak enough to be politically pressured. So, essentially, Scarborough Shoal is China's key to the Pacific Ocean. Of course, the United States has an interest here. A large part of Chinese trade passes through the South China Sea. If the supplies are successfully blocked, the sky's economy won't last long. The cruel irony is that the U.S. economy, which is heavily dependent on Chinese imports, won't hold up either. Taiwan is also nearby. In recent years, the U.S. Navy has been directing its ships to the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea on a zigzag course, rather than the shortest route, as established by international rules. The Americans are making it clear that they do not recognize the South China Sea as Beijing's exclusive zone. At the same time, the Chinese fleet is reacting to this, tracking American ships and demanding that they leave the Chinese exclusive economic zone. As a result, it turns out that the United States did not sign the law on international maritime law, but demands its observance from all other countries. And China recognizes the legal force of the agreement, but grossly violates its regulations. Vietnam. The relationship between China and Vietnam is probably the most diverse and has changed over the course of their historical paths. The first Vietnamese states appeared in deep antiquity, in the area of modern South China. Then there was the so-called thousand-year dependence, which lasted for about 800 years. In Vietnamese, this period is called Bac Thuoc, when we belonged to the north. For most of this historical stage, Vietnam was considered a Chinese province. But since China came into the political space where its own statehood already existed, the Vietnamese simply could not accept the new power. In the struggles, the identity of future Vietnam was formed, and the main rebel Ngo Kio Yen inflicted damage on the Chinese troops and led the country to independence in the 938th year. With the beginning of the colonial period in Vietnam and the semi-colonial dependence of China, both countries were little interested in each other, being occupied with internal problems. When World War II in Asia ended, it was the Chinese troops that went to accept the surrender of Japanese divisions in the north of Vietnam. After the Communists came to power in China in the 40s, a long honeymoon period ensued in relations with Vietnam. The People's Republic of China helped North Vietnam in the fight first with France and then with the United States of America. The talk was about the supply of military and civilian equipment, food, and construction of facilities. The Chinese claim that from the 50s to the 80s, they provided their neighbor with assistance amounting to more than $20 billion. The leaders of the two countries, in their own metaphorical manner, asserted that China and Vietnam were as close as lips and teeth. However, Vietnam was caught between the conflicts and disagreements of the People's Republic of China and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. When Hanoi and Moscow signed a friendship and cooperation agreement, it became clear that the Vietnamese had finally chosen a side in the People's Republic of China and Union of Soviet Socialist Republics conflict. By the end of the same year, Vietnamese forces had moved into Cambodia. In January of '79, they took the capital Phnom Penh. But by February, Chinese forces had crossed the border to teach the Vietnamese a lesson, as pro-Chinese authorities were in power in Cambodia. The Chinese quickly occupied 3 northern provinces, but the Vietnamese tactic of dragging out military actions and switching to guerrilla warfare, partisan warfare, was something the Chinese could not handle. The Socialist War lasted exactly 1 month. The People's Republic of China preferred to withdraw its troops from the territory of its neighbor, officially declaring that they had fulfilled their task. After the Vietnamese left Cambodia, relations quickly recovered and returned to normal. Today, the relations between the People's Republic of China and Vietnam are formally in the best condition. Officially, they are referred to as Comprehensive Partnership and Strategic Cooperation. In the present Confucian manner, Beijing and Hanoi describe their dialogue using beautiful formulas. 16 golden hieroglyphs, goodwill and friendship, comprehensive cooperation, long-term stability, future-oriented, and 4 good neighbors, good friends, good comrades, good partners. Undoubtedly, the key unifying factor for China and Vietnam is the similarity of political regimes. Despite the weakening role of ideological dogmas, the two communist parties are very close. But formality remains formality. We have already talked about the threat from the Paracel Islands. In the economy, there is also a strong trade imbalance in favor of the People's Republic of China, which has been growing continuously over the last decade. Meanwhile, China views Vietnam as inferior. It was the Chinese who, during the Protectorate period, gave Vietnam the colonial name Annam, which means pacified South. In one decree of the 980th year, the emperor compares Vietnam to a finger on his hand that can get sick. You need to take medicine. If it doesn't help, resort to acupuncture and cauterization. The attempts of the Vietnamese to avoid acupuncture and cauterization are only causing annoyance in Beijing today. Australia, in 2012, after secret negotiations, Solomon Islands and China signed an agreement on security cooperation. This event shocked Australia, which views the Pacific region as its backyard. The media began to discuss the prospect of creating a Chinese naval base near Australia. And just a few months before this news, the Solomon Islands turned to Australia for help in suppressing anti-government unrest. Now Beijing will receive similar privileges. Being on the edge of the world, Canberra relies on a simple rule. The country's foreign policy is formed in alliance with the main naval power of the world to protect its interests. Since the 1940s, the United States has taken on this role, but their relationship is asymmetrical. Canberra needs Washington more than it needs the United States of America. In plain terms, Australian politicians are increasing the strategic weight of their state by offering the United States a platform from which they can wage war against China in the Asia-Pacific region. The countries have concluded the Intelligence Alliance, Five Eyes, and the Military Alliance, Australia, New Zealand, United States Security Treaty. Australia's unique location gives it a host of advantages. This is the secret Pine Gap Base, which collects intelligence for the United States of America. The base detects rockets, controls drones, intercepts signal transmissions across all of Eurasia, and communicates with spy satellites in geosynchronous orbit. And on the northwestern Cape, the naval station transmits data to U.S. submarines. This allows American submarines to counter Chinese nuclear submarines in the region. There is an opinion that Canberra's policy undermines its own economic interests, as China is its largest trading partner. Trade mainly consists of minerals. Australia supplies celestial iron ore, which produces as much as 900 million tons annually, more than twice as much as Brazil, which ranks second in extraction. Since there are no other large suppliers, Australian mining companies are confident that Chinese demand will remain. Another important aspect of Australia's economy, it is shaped by lobbying. Considering the economic weight of China, one could assume that business will insist on friendly relations with Beijing. But 15 out of the 20 largest companies listed on the Australian Stock Exchange belong to American shareholders. As we have already said, China wants to break through Washington's containment ring along the first chain of islands. And from an economic point of view, Beijing is looking for profitable investments in the Pacific region, penetrating into the only sphere of interest in Australia. China has gained access to the airfields and ports of Kiribati, Vanuatu, and French Polynesia, and also established police and military ties in Fiji and Papua New Guinea. The fight is on for every little thing. For example, in 2017, the Solomon Islands tried to sign a contract for the laying of a submarine internet cable to Sydney. But the Australian intelligence put a veto on the deal, fearing that Beijing could use the cable infrastructure to monitor internet traffic. As a result, Canberra intervened and laid the cable itself. And in 2020, it joined forces with Tokyo and Washington to lay a similar cable to Palau. Then, in 2019, when Papua New Guinea turned to Beijing for help in refinancing its debts, Canberra responded with a loan package of $302 million. Moreover, it developed a response plan to the Chinese initiative One Belt, One Road. This Pacific program includes assistance to countries amounting to $1 billion, an infrastructure financing mechanism worth $1.4 billion, and a labor mobility scheme that allows Pacific region citizens to work in Australia. It established the Pacific Security College for the training of police and military personnel. Finally, Australia purchased a mobile operator working throughout the region. Meanwhile, China has established Pacific ground stations for its Beidou satellite navigation system. Like its American counterpart, Beidou can be used as a guidance system for missiles and weapon delivery systems. Thus, police, infrastructure, and telecommunications have become key fields in the battle for power in the Pacific region. Japan. The history of relations between Japan and China also has a lot of interesting things. For centuries, in the eyes of the Chinese, the Japanese were just Eastern barbarians, absorbing the wisdom of the celestial, literacy, religion, architecture. However, the situation changed later. While China was losing war after war to the Europeans, increasingly isolating itself, Japan was modernizing and adopting the achievements of European civilization. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894–95 ended with a crushing defeat for the Heavenly Kingdom. After this, the roles of the countries completely changed, and Chinese intellectuals, including the future father of the nation Sun Yat-sen, went to Japan to study. The Tongmenghui organization, created in Tokyo, became the driving force of the Xinhai Revolution of 1911. However, soon anarchy and civil war began in China, and the Japanese almost unopposedly seized Manchuria, creating a puppet state there, Manchukuo. By 1936, the military and Japanese leadership had finally taken over, and the following year, Japan declared war on China. It was World War II that shaped the current relationship of the Chinese to their neighbor. What the Japanese forces did in the country from 1937 to 1945, China calls genocide. According to Chinese historians, the victims of the Japanese were around 7 million military personnel and more than 17 million civilians. The most terrifying episode was the Nanjing Massacre. After 3 months of fighting for Shanghai, the Japanese moved on to the then capital of China, Nanjing. The atrocities began even on the way. While the Japanese forces were heading towards the defenseless city, Two Japanese officers were competing in the killings of unarmed Chinese prisoners. The duel was recklessly commented on by Japanese newspapers. Initially, the dispute was about who would kill 100 people faster with a sword. It was not possible to determine the winner, and an additional round was required to kill 150 people quickly. What the Japanese did a few days later in Nanking looked more like a cold-blooded and planned extermination. All men of conscription age were taken out of the city and killed, after which the massacre began in the city itself. We won't describe all the horrors now. It's worth just mentioning that both chemical and biological weapons were used in that war. After Japan surrendered, 920 people were executed by the International Tribunal, and another 475 received life sentences. The problem is that the level of investigation that the Allies conducted in Germany was not carried out in Japan. So among the accused, Emperor Hirohito was excluded, whose signature was under most of the criminal orders, and many war criminals received minor sentences. After the war, relations between Tokyo and Beijing were built on the formula cold in politics, hot in the economy. Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, the author of the anti-communist doctrine of foreign policy, stated in private conversations that he didn't care what the Chinese were, whether they were red or green, as long as they bought Japanese goods. In 1973, the countries restored diplomatic relations, and Japanese state investments flowed smoothly into the People's Republic of China. But the Chinese did not forgive the Japanese. They were outraged by the visits of Japanese leaders to the Yasukuni Shrine, where the souls of soldiers who died for Japan are honored, and the rewriting of school textbooks. So, according to Japanese authors, there was no massacre in Nanking. The city was taken almost bloodlessly, with only 20,000 people dying, a negligible number of casualties during the capture of the stronghold. Photographs, forgeries, and the witnesses are lying. Ultimately, an irresolvable contradiction emerges. At the official level, Tokyo has been expressing regrets about the events of that war for decades. At the same time, Japanese courts were denying Chinese citizens the consideration of compensation cases. This understandably caused irritation in Beijing. The Japanese, not wanting to quarrel with their neighbor, fueled Chinese dissatisfaction with new loans, the total volume of which reached $30 billion by the end of the decade. Then the situation turned upside down again. In the 90s, Japan began to fall into political and economic crises, while China experienced a rapid economic growth. Now, China is the largest and most influential player in Asia. So that the Chinese don't get any ideas, everyone in the region has to deal with the celestial. And it's unlikely the situation will change anytime soon. All we can do is monitor the situation in Asia and draw lessons for ourselves.